Welcome back to Buddhist Audio Bookshelf. Today, we embark on the next chapter of Dharma Talks by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, Geoffrey DeGraff. Join us as we navigate these enlightening teachings. Meticulously curated by our team, this audiobook is a conduit for Buddha's wisdom. Your help in spreading these teachings is vital. Subscribe, like, and share to amplify their reach. Let's collectively enrich the world with the profound guidance of Buddha. Relax and absorb the essence of these teachings as we dive into today's reading. Achieving Balance. November 22, 2008. An important principle in meditating, in getting the mind to settle down properly, is to develop a sense of balance, so that your desire isn't so strong that it runs away with you or so weak that you don't really care. Your effort isn't so strong that it wears you out, but not so weak that you don't accomplish anything. And so on down the line. You don't want to think too much because that destroys your concentration. But it's also possible not to think enough as when you have a problem, and don't try to think it through to discover the cause. So we're looking for balance here. But remember that balance doesn't come automatically. Think of those old-fashioned scales. Before they reach balance, they have to tip first one way and then the other and then back and forth, gradually tipping less and less until they finally achieve balance. This means that if you find yourself tipping one direction and then the other in your meditation, that's going to be natural. The skill lies in learning how to balance things out, so that you're tipping less and less and less. First off, you have to realize which direction you're tipping in. This is why it's good to take stock as you sit down and meditate. How is your mind right now? What does it need? Does it need encouragement? Does it need energizing? Or does it need to be calmed down? Is it too sluggish? If it is, you have to do a little thinking to stir it up a little bit. Remember the Buddha's reflection that this evening's sunset may have been the last one you're going to see. That big earthquake they keep warning about could happen. The new fault that just opened just to the north of us could suddenly do something strange. So the question is, if that were to happen, would you be ready to go? And for most of us the answer is no. All this unfinished business, all these things we'd still like to do. Okay, what's the most important unfinished business? Getting your mind in shape, so that it's not your own enemy in the face of sudden events. Which means that you've got to work on your meditation. Sometimes that thought will help stir you up. Then look at what you need to do to energize the mind even further to keep it awake. You might decide that you need to go through the parts of the body. Think about the different bones in your skeleton. What have you got? Imagine all the bones starting from the toes coming on up. Where are those bones? In other words, when you think about the bones in the toe, focus on the feeling in the toe. With the bones in your feet, focus on the feelings in your feet, and so on, up through the body. This way you give the mind work to do. If your mind won't settle down with the bones, survey the breath energy in the different parts of your body. Start, say, at your navel, go up the front of the body, down the back, out the legs. Start again at the back of the neck, go down the shoulders and out the arms. Section by section. How does the body feel as you breathe in? How does it feel as you breathe out? If you notice any sense of tension or tightness anywhere, allow it to relax. This gives the mind work to do so that it doesn't start drifting off as it stays with the breath. If you find, though, that your problem is in the other direction, that the mind is too active, try to stay in one place and put all your energy in trying to protect that one place. If you find your thoughts wandering off, ask yourself, why do I need to think about that now? Isn't it more important to get to work here? If you're worried about situations in the future, remind yourself that your best preparation for the future is to become mindful, alert, clear about where your mind is going. All the more reason to stay focused right here to develop those qualities. And then be very protective of the spot you've chosen. As you focus on that spot, allow it to become comfortable. A sense of comfort is important because it helps you stay. If there's a sense of dis-ease and blockage in the body, you're going to try to get out and run away from it, because the mind doesn't see any advantage in staying here. But if you see that as you stay here, things begin to dissolve away, these patterns of tension grow less and less solid, less and less rigid, just the fact of being in your body is going to feel a lot more attractive. You see immediate results that the meditation is not simply aimed at results on and off into the future, but also gives results right here and now. And while working on blockage in one part of the body, if you're focusing right on the spot of the blockage and it doesn't seem to work, focus on other parts of the body, because sometimes the blockage or pain or tightness may be caused by a blockage someplace else. It's common, for instance, that a pain in your lower back is actually caused by blockage in your upper back, or pain in your legs is caused by a blockage in your lower back or the base of the spine. Or a pain in the right side of the body is caused by a corresponding tightness on the left. Something in front may be caused by something in back. So check around and notice how you're talking to yourself as you do this. If you have a tendency to get really harsh and negative with yourself, remind yourself we're not here to be harsh and negative. Putting in proper effort doesn't require that you hold a whip over yourself all the time. Again, it's part of balance, learning how to know when to use the carrot and when to use the stick. If you find yourself harsh and negative, remind yourself, okay, the fact that you're here meditating is good in and of itself. The ideal approach is simply to be a matter of fact. The mind is wandering off, okay, just bring it back. If it's wandering off again, bring it back again. However many times it wanders off, just keep bringing it back and try to keep a good humor about the whole thing. This, combined with mindfulness, is probably your best guarantee of getting the mind into balance, so that when things aren't going the way you'd like them to, you don't get upset, you don't get flustered. You simply take it into account and see what you can do to balance it out. So try to think in ways that are encouraging. When you catch yourself wandering off, at least you've caught yourself. Most people wander off and never catch themselves. Their whole days, their whole lives are spent just wandering around aimlessly with no control over the mind at all, or just enough to get by. But each time you catch yourself and bring yourself back, you're strengthening your mindfulness, you're strengthening your alertness. That in and of itself is a good thing. It's an accomplishment. Reserve the stick for the times when you're really careless and lazy. And the stick, of course, is recollection of death, something we don't like to think about, but it's there in the background all the time. And it's not going to go away by our not thinking about it. So remind yourself that meditation is your best preparation for the time when you're going to die, because at that point the mind will grasp at anything. It can't stay in the body anymore. You're afraid of what's going to happen if you let go of the body, but you've got to let go of the body, so you grab at whatever comes up in the mind and then there it goes, heading who knows where. So the question now is, can you train the mind to be more compassed even in that kind of circumstance, and not go flailing around? The way to do that, of course, is to learn how to sit with the breath, and learn how to be patient with the breath, and to let go of everything else. Develop the quality of consistency. Develop your mindfulness. And keep in mind the fact that whatever comes up, you don't want to grab onto the things that are going to be harmful. If you're going to hold on to something, hold on to things that are skillful. The attitudes that will see you through whatever the difficulty. That won't get blown away. If you find yourself blown away now by a little bit of pain or a little bit of distraction, it's going to be really difficult when big pains and big distractions come. That thought is the stick to remind yourself that you've got work to do. So achieving balance means that, when you find yourself leaning to the left, you've got to lean hard to the right. If you're leaning to the right, lean hard to the left. Finding balance doesn't mean using middling effort all the time. If you've gone too far in one direction, you've got to lean hard in the other direction until you reach the point of balance. Use the principle they call negative feedback, which doesn't mean being negative about yourself. It means that if you find yourself going too far in one direction, you'll learn to balance things out. All too often the mind gets into what's called positive feedback, which is not necessarily a positive thing. Positive feedback means that you're going in one direction, and you just keep tipping more and more and more in that direction. You find yourself angry, then you get angry at yourself for being angry, and then angry at yourself for being angry 2 times. That doesn't help. Or you find yourself getting kind of lazy and blurt out, and you say, well, this is kind of comfortable. I like this. Then you just go for the lazy, blurt out state of mind. You've got to be able to step back from whatever the situation in the mind and say, in what direction are we out of balance, and how can we put it back into balance? You'll find yourself tipping to left, tipping to the right, back and forth, but it's normal. It's natural. Over time you develop the skill so that the tipping gets less and less, gets more and more subtle, until finally you've achieved balance. There's a sense of just right. The mind fits into the body like a glove. It stays with its object, with a sense of ease and belonging. You feel like you're here at home, at last. And then all you do is simply maintain that balance. In the course of developing that sense of just right, you develop a lot of good qualities of mind. This is where a lot of the skill comes in the meditation. This is what the learning in the meditation amounts to. Learning how to lean left and lean right when you need to, so that ultimately you get into balance. Then you learn how to stay in balance. You've probably noticed, when you watch an acrobat walking across a tightrope, that there are times when the acrobat is perfectly balanced, other times there will be a slight slipping off of balance. But the acrobat has learned how to correct for it. That's how acrobats don't fall. It's not that they never tip, but they know immediately how to tip in the other direction, back and forth, until they are balanced again. In the same way, even though there will be a lot of back and forth in the meditation, it aims toward balance. And it maintains your balance. So don't get upset by it. Learn how to use it to bring the mind to that state where it feels really at home. Settled, secure. Or as we say in that chant, so that it looks after itself with ease. It gains a sense of maturity, a sense of good humor and confidence. That comes from experience. That you can deal with whatever comes up. Beyond Inter-Eating. November 26, 2008. In Pali, the word for enjoying something is the same as the word for eating it. When you're enjoying a mind state, you're feeding on the mind state. If you enjoy relationship, you're feeding on the relationship. And as the Buddha points out over and over again, to be in a position where you have to feed is to be in a position where you have to suffer. And not only are you suffering, but the people or whatever it is you're feeding on suffers as well. We've got to keep this point in mind. That as long as the mind needs to feed, it's causing suffering. And the greatest act of kindness both to yourself and other people is to put it in a position where it doesn't need to feed. We tend to forget this. We think that sitting here meditating, trying to get the mind under control, is a selfish thing because we don't see how other people benefit. But actually it's one of the kindest things you can do, because if the mind is in a position where it needs to feed, that means it needs a constant food source. And if you don't get the food source you want, you start scrambling around, trying to find another food source, and at the same time you feel threatened, fearful. And we know what the mind does when it feels threatened and fearful. Its stupidest things, most heartless things, thoughtless things, mindless things. Someone did a study of prisoners, people who tend to live in fear not only while they're in the prison, but also when they're out on the streets in a position where they feel fearful, threatened, and commit their crimes. They did brain scans of these people and discovered that they don't use their frontal lobe very much. The lizard brain is more in action because once you're in fear, that's the part of the brain that takes over. In a situation like that, when you use the frontal lobe, it's basically to rationalize what you've already done. The decisions that the lizard brain made. So the frontal lobe is there for rationalizations, it's not for reasoning. Reasoning is basically the thinking you do before you make a decision, the thinking you do that actually weighs things as to whether they're right or wrong, wise or unwise. That kind of thinking can happen only when you're not feeling threatened. So think about it, what state is your mind in? Is it in a position where it has to feed? It's going to feel threatened at some point or another because all our food sources are limited, whether physical food or emotional food, mental food. If you let the mind continually feed on its thoughts, it's developing bad habits. It's in that feeding mode. So what you've got to learn how to do as a meditator is to feed in a new way, in a way that eventually gets the mind into a position where it doesn't have to feed anymore. You have to strengthen it. First, you have to have the conviction this is something you can do, that you have it within your power to strengthen the mind in this way. In other words, that your actions and decisions really do make a difference. This conviction is what gets you started on the path. And it gives you strength you need to get started. Until you start seeing results, you need to operate on the principle of conviction, because the path requires effort and persistence. You've got to stick with it because the mind has its old habits, and it's easy to slip into its old habits. You meditate for a while and things aren't going well, and you want to give the mind a hit of whatever pleasure it's used to feeding on. When that happens, you have to keep reminding yourself, no, come back to the breath. This is where mindfulness comes in. To keep reminding you that sitting around and thinking about whatever kind of thought you like to feed on, whether it's thoughts of kindness or thoughts of anger, skillful thoughts or unskillful thoughts, you're continuing the mind's old habits. It likes to take on an identity in these thought worlds, and that taking on an identity is precisely what needs to be fed. So you try to develop a new identity. The meditator who's mindful, who's heading in a different direction. This is an identity that needs to be fed as well, but it's one of those identities that ultimately leads in the right direction. So keep reminding yourself, come back to the breath so you can be in a position where you can watch those thought worlds, pull yourself away from them. The stronger your mindfulness, the more you get into good solid states of concentration. Again, this is a skillful kind of feeding. You're feeding on the sense of ease, on the sense of rapture and refreshment that can come in the concentration. It's good food and relatively harmless. Blameless. There's nothing unskillful about it. If you can feed on this, that takes a lot of the weight and pressure off your relationships with other people, which is why concentration is an act of kindness. You're not feeding on them in the same way. You've got a better source of food inside, a more reliable source of food inside. And it's one that can allow you to watch this process of how a thought world arises in the mind, and how you take on an identity in that thought world. Where it is that you make that decision to slip into this different world, as you move out of the world of the breath and the world of the body into the world of your thought. Why do you do that? How does it happen? You've already got some practice in pulling yourself out of these thoughts simply as you develop mindfulness and concentration. But the concentration allows you to see them even more clearly as processes. You see how they form, you can see how they disband. You see the precise points where you're making a decision to move in. And continue creating more and more form and feeling and perceptions and thought constructs and consciousness in that thought world, all of which involve taking on an identity which in turn takes a lot of food. So only when you see the harm of that process do you realize this is what you've been doing all along. Your interactions with other people have been a kind of feeding. We don't like to think about it, but interbeing, the idea that we're all connected, basically comes down to intereating. We feed on other people. Even when we're nice to them, we feed on them. And the feeding seems to come first. The niceness comes second. This is why I see so many cases of people being nice to people in the ways they want to be nice to them, but without much thought as to what the people on the receiving end really need. It's only when you don't have to feed on people that you can really see what they need, and provide it if you can. So these 5 strengths that provide food for the mind also bring it to the point, ultimately, where it sees through the need to feed, sees something even more lasting in which you don't take on a state of being, which means that you don't need to feed. There is one verse in the canon where they talk about feeding on nibbana. You feed on it freely in the sense that there's no cost, there are no drawbacks, you're not harming anybody, you're not harming yourself, you're not harming other people. But most of the descriptions that discuss the issue of feeding with regard to nibbana say that it's a state of no hungering. You don't need to feed at all, because you're not taking on the identity in that thought world or in the world outside. This is why meditation is an act of kindness. You're putting the mind in a position where it doesn't have to be threatened by a lack of food, because you don't need food. And even on the path, you're developing sources of food inside that require less and less and less from other people, and place less and less of a burden on yourself, less of a burden on them. So that you're less likely to be coming from that part of the lizard brain that always wants to feed and is afraid when there's no source of food around. So that the more reasonable part of your mind can continue reasoning and not just rationalizing what you've already done. You reason about what you see as the proper thing to do in the future or here in the present. That's the proper use of that part of your brain, but you can use it that way only when there's no sense of dread, no fear. So when you start wondering what you're doing for the world sitting here enjoying pleasant sensations in the body, well, you're feeding on the pleasant sensations in the body, which means that you're not having to feed on other people. That in and of itself is something of a gift, but it also puts you on the path where you can go to a more advanced level, where ultimately you don't even need to feed on these pleasant states of mind, pleasant states of the body. They're helpful and they're harmless, but the most harmless thing is a mind that doesn't have to eat, doesn't have to feed, doesn't have to enjoy things, doesn't have to indulge in things, because it has everything it already needs. This way you're not only placing less of a burden on other people, you're also providing them with a good example. That it is possible not to feel threatened, not to feel fearful, not because you suppress your fear, but you put yourself in a different position entirely. You find a different position entirely, a position that nothing else can assail. The Karma of Pleasure. November 29, 2008. A couple years back, when the psychology of happiness was beginning to become popular, I was asked to review a book on the topic to give a Buddhist perspective on the issue. I said one of the things the book was missing was an understanding of karma, that in your pursuit for happiness, you do things that have an impact on other people and have an impact on yourself. And so you have to weigh the happiness that you get from those actions against their long-term results. And the editor of the magazine that I wrote this for said he was surprised that I had focused on that as the Buddhist issue, while I was surprised that he was surprised. Because the principle of cause and effect is what the Buddha said lay at the heart of his awakening. When he summarized his awakening in one sentence, he'd stated as the principle of when this is, that is, when this isn't, that isn't. From the arising of this comes the arising of that, from the cessation of this comes the cessation of that. Then he would expand on what that meant. But that for him was the essence of his awakening, in particular the arising of this or the when this is. One of the big issues, of course, is the arising of your intentions. When intentions arise, what happens? These intentions have both an immediate impact and a long-term impact. We have to take both into consideration as we look for happiness, because sometimes the things we do will give a short-term happiness, but then in the long term they cause trouble for ourselves and for other people. I was amazed that the book on happiness didn't consider at all how people's conception of happiness would actually have an impact on other people. The book was trying to be scientific. It said, well, sometimes torturers and terrorists have their views on happiness, and who are we as objective observers to pass judgment on them? But of course you have to take into consideration the impact these activities have on other people, because other people aren't going to just sit still and let you enjoy a happiness that's going to cause them suffering. Even if they die from your efforts, they're going to come back. Their relatives and friends are going to come back at you. That's built into the way things are. So as you look for pleasure and happiness in life, you've got to take into consideration what you're doing to get that happiness, and what the long-term impact of that doing is going to be. Pleasure, happiness, bliss, ease. The Pali word for all of those things is sukha. And as you look for sukha, what is it? It's a feeling. Feelings are fabricated. In other words, even in the experiencing of a feeling, there's already a certain amount of intention. We have potentials that come in from our past actions, and then our present intentions shape those potentials into a feeling. That's what the mind spends a lot of its time creating all the time. We're doing it right here as we meditate. We've got a body that's relatively healthy. We have a certain amount of experience with the breath. That's the past karma we're working with. And then we're trying to fashion that past karma into an experience of well-being in the present moment. In the beginning, you focus on trying to create a sense of ease and well-being with the breath. To get established in that sense of ease, you have to indulge in it. That too is a type of action, a type of karma. You create the feeling and then you settle in it. But the trick is that if you simply wallow in the feeling of pleasure and let go of the breath, the pleasure's not going to last very long. Ajahn Lee's image is of a person who works and gains a salary. Some people, as soon as they get their first paycheck, skip work and spend their money. To keep getting your paycheck, you have to keep on working. If you want to get a raise, you have to keep on working well. The same principle applies to the meditation. If you stick with the breath, even in the midst of the pleasure keeps on coming. If you get more skilled in how you stay with the breath, the pleasure increases. Even when you don't wallow in it, it's still there, doing its work for your well-being. And you're allowed to enjoy the pleasure because this is a blameless pleasure. The Buddha, like so many rich people, led a life of total indulgence when he was still a prince. When he left the home life, he went off to the other extreme. He was afraid of pleasure. He had seen the impact of pleasure on his mind, that it made him intoxicated, blurred his understanding. So he ran off in the other direction. Total self-torture. He would go into a trance where he wouldn't allow himself to breathe, and even though it caused huge pains in the body, he just stuck with it. He would eat as little as possible, till he would faint each time he would urinate or defecate. And finally, after 6 years of that, he realized that this was as far as you can go in self-torment. Fainting and growing weak. It didn't lead to awakening. The question was, could there be another way? Because self-torment obviously wasn't getting results. He recollected a time when he was a child and had naturally entered the first jhana. He asked himself, could this be the way? And something inside him said, yes. If so, why am I afraid of that pleasure? Because prior to that he had lumped all pleasure together as bad. He asked himself, is there anything blameworthy about that pleasure? No. It doesn't harm anybody else. It doesn't intoxicate the mind, doesn't blur your awareness. He said, okay, this is a pleasure I can pursue. But he realized also that he would have to eat if he was going to have the strength to do that. That's how he got onto the middle path, realizing that there are some pleasures whose pursuit is blameless. So that's why we're here. To develop this blameless sense of pleasure and then to use it further. You don't just stop with the pleasure. You try to use it as a basis for understanding the mind even further. Particularly, you want to understand the issue of suffering. You want to comprehend it. That's the duty the Buddha says we have with regard to suffering and stress. You want to comprehend it. You comprehend it by knowing it so thoroughly that you become dispassionate toward it. Ordinarily you might not think that we have passion for suffering, but we do. So many things that we enjoy in life involve suffering and stress. Yet we get quite passionate about them. So you want to understand the process through which you're creating a lot of unnecessary stress, a lot of unnecessary suffering, both for yourself and for others. See the drawbacks of that kind of attachment, that kind of passion. And the only way you're going to see those drawbacks is to give yourself a more blameless form of pleasure, so you can look at, say, sensual pleasure, and not be so hungry for it. If you're hungering for it, it's got to be good. That's the attitude we have. But if you can appease that hunger for pleasure with the pleasure of a well-concentrated mind, then you can look at these other pleasures and willingly admit that they do have their drawbacks. They involve intoxication. You have to blot out large areas of your awareness if you're going to enjoy them. It's like listening to a concert of music. The concert hall is designed so that you lose your awareness of other people. It's dark. Everybody is supposed to be quiet. You don't want anything interfering with your experience of the music. And so you have to blot out large areas of your awareness. Your awareness of the people around you, your awareness of any background noise. That's one of the drawbacks of that kind of pleasure. the mind becomes less attuned to a lot of things. It has to blot out huge areas of awareness so that it can wallow in what it wants to focus on. That's a metaphor for a lot of our lives and the pleasures that we have. We have to pretend that a lot of things aren't there so we can focus exclusively on the details we like. That's pleasure. And then there's pain. How do you deal with, how are you going to comprehend pain? Because for most of us, our experience with pain is that we want to push it away. We feel threatened by it, invaded by it. And the only way you're going to actually comprehend it is to have this alternative foundation for the mind, a place where you take a stance and can feel at ease, settled, secure enough that you can then look into the pain and not feel so threatened by it, have a certain amount of objectivity in the way you look at it, so you can really comprehend, oh, pain comes from this. And this is what I've been doing to create it. Only when the mind has this sense of an inner security from the concentration can it really perform our duty with regard to stress, which is to comprehend it to the point of dispassion. So that's the skillful way to deal with pleasure, the skillful kind of karma around pleasure. Try to create a pleasure that's harmless, then use that experience of pleasure for a further purpose. That's not the way we usually relate to pleasure. We like to indulge in it. And we don't like to hear that there's karma associated with that. We want our pleasures to be free. The only pleasure that's really free, though, as the Buddha said, is nibbana. Even the practice of jhana requires that we have a body that's alive and needs to feed, so there's a certain amount of burdensomeness placed on other people, other beings. The only truly free pleasure is one that's not even a feeling. As the Buddha says, it's a pleasure that doesn't come under the 5 aggregates. It's known by a consciousness that doesn't come out of the 5 aggregates and isn't known by means of the sense media. That's something really special. But the only way to find that is, first, to develop this ability to create a sense of ease and well-being within the body through the breath, a sense of ease and well-being that come from secluding the mind from unskillful states, getting the mind concentrated, and really seeing the karma of pleasure. This is what you've got to do in order to create a sense of well-being that's relatively blameless. Then you can use that pleasure for the purpose of even higher pleasure, and even more blameless pleasure. Free both in the sense that you don't have to spend any money for it, you don't have to do anything for it. And in the sense that you're not harming anybody at all because it's totally outside of the patterns of cause and effect. But to get there, you have to understand how pleasure, our usual experience of pleasure, is totally enmeshed in cause and effect. Then you have to weigh the things that you're doing to give rise to that pleasure, the things you do as a result of that pleasure, and then the impact they have on other people. All those things have to be weighed very carefully. But when you approach the issue with wisdom and understanding, you finally can get to the thing we all want. The pleasure. That's totally free. So as you go through life and find yourself consuming pleasures, realize that there's an intentional activity even in the production of the pleasure, in the experiencing of the pleasure, and in the enjoyment of the pleasure. Try to become as sensitive as possible to what that intention is and what its effects are, so that your attitude toward pleasure can become more responsible and more productive on the path that leads to a pleasure that's totally free. The Rivers of Karma. December 7, 2008. When you're meditating, you're engaging in a form of karma, which the Buddha identified with intention. The intention here is to stay with the breath, to try to be fully aware of the breath element in the body, throughout the whole body. You want to maintain that intention in the face of all the other intentions that are going to come up in the course of the hour. It's to be expected. Vagrant thoughts will come into the mind about tomorrow, about today, yesterday. And you've got to realize that those thoughts are not in line with the original intention. No matter how useful or important they may seem, they're not what you want right now. You're trying to be very clear about what your intention is right now and how to stick with it. Because this is really all you've got. Your present intention. Think about times when you're ill, when difficult situations come up in life, and you look around, and there seems to be no means of escape. Actually, though, there is an escape. Your one escape will be the intentions in your mind at that time. Say that there's a pain coming up. You're ill, and no matter what painkiller the doctors give you, there's still pain. How are you going to deal with it? Your best way of dealing with it has to do with your intention. Remind yourself that if you think about how long you've been in pain, or how much longer you're going to be in pain, that's going to weigh the mind down unnecessarily. You want to simply be aware of the sensation of the pain right now, without all those other narratives. As for the questions of why there's pain and whether it's just or how frustrated you may feel about it, you've got to learn how to put those aside as well. In other words, as you're sitting here meditating, putting aside random thoughts, you're getting practice for a skill you're really going to need as aging, illness, and death come closing in. As the Buddha said, there are two ways of developing qualities of mind that are really helpful in cases like that. One is to learn how to develop unlimited goodwill for all beings, yourself included, and the people around you. He says, when the mind has that unlimited quality, it's like a huge river. Someone may come along and try to make the river stop, but they can't make the river stop because the river is so large. They can try to make the river be without water, they'll try to dump it out with pails, but they can't do that because there is so much water in the river. Even if you put a lump of salt in the river, you can still drink the water because there is so much more water in the river. As you're able to maintain that unlimited state of mind, the issues that come up with pain and illness, or as death approaches, will seem a lot smaller than if your mind is limited and concerned only with the narratives that you've been carrying around all the time. This is another way in which meditation is good for you. You learn how to step out of those narratives. When aging, illness, and death come, you see it as an opportunity to handle them skillfully. Because part of that unlimited frame of mind reminds you that everybody goes through these things. You're not being singled out. This is a universal process. That helps take some of the sting away. The other skills you need, as the Buddha said, are learning how to keep the mind from being overcome by pain and being overcome by pleasure. And again, these are among the skills you learn as you're meditating. Pain comes up in the body, and you learn the appropriate ways of dealing with it. In some cases that means focusing on another part of the body that's not in pain to give the mind a sense of safe haven here in the present moment. When it has developed a sense of strength, the sense of well-being that can come from that sense of have, then you can start looking into the pain. To what extent is the pain affected by the way you breathe? To what extent is it affected by your concepts about the pain? If you regard the experience of pain as a total given, it's hard to get away from it. But if you realize you're involved in constructing the pain, your concept of it is going to have an actual effect on how you experience it. The mind is built in this way. You've got all these pain receptors in your body, along with the various parts of your nervous system, that make the decision as to which little pains you're going to pay attention to, and which ones you're going to ignore. Most of this happens on a subconscious level, but as you meditate you train yourself to become more conscious of it. You learn how to take that ability to focus and ignore, and use it deliberately for the purpose of keeping the mind from suffering. This is a skill we learn as we meditate. At the same time, we learn how not to be overcome by pleasure. First, there are sensual pleasures, which we tend to go running to as our main escape from pain. And as long as we see them as our only escape, we don't like to look at their negative side. But it's an important skill in the meditation. If you really want the mind to settle down and gain good solid concentration to develop insight, you've got to learn how to look at the downside of sensual pleasures, how unreliable they are, and how they make you do all kinds of stupid things, or how you make yourself do stupid things just to keep them going. But to really let go of these pleasures requires more than just seeing their drawbacks. It also requires that you find an alternative pleasure. That's the pleasure that comes from keeping the mind still. As the Buddha said, there's no true pleasure aside from peace. So you look for your pleasure, for your happiness. In the mind at peace, allowing it to be still, allowing it to be centered, and learning how to maintain it, that stillness, that sense of being centered regardless of what comes up. Some of your first practice in this is when you finally settle down and the breath is calm. It feels refreshing. When that happens, it's very easy to lose your focus on the breath and move over to the sense of pleasure. It's like falling into a hole. You're skating on ice, and all of a sudden you skate off to where it's too thin and fall through the ice into water. In other words, you've abandoned the cause because you've gotten so infatuated with the effect. But if you can realize that the effect is still there, the pleasure is still there in the body, and you don't have to go rushing after it, you don't have to go gobbling it down, it will still have its good effects on the body and its good effects on the mind even as you stay focused on the breath. You see it as not something that you're going to jump on, but simply as a sign that the mind is beginning to settle down. You're beginning to see results in the meditation. It's like a sign on the road. When you pass a sign that says you're entering such and such a town, or there's a town X number of miles ahead, you don't leave the road to drive on the sign. You stay on the road. In the same way, you stay with the breath. In this way you learn how to use the pleasure of concentration without being overwhelmed by it. Now, it's not that you're afraid of the pleasure of concentration. I don't know many times you hear the topic of jhana or concentration introduced, and almost the first thing they say before they've even told you what it is, they tell you it's dangerous. That's a really perverse approach. Right concentration is not dangerous in that way. It helps separate you from the dangers of being sucked in by sensual pleasures. It provides you with an alternative to sensual pleasures. As the Buddha points out, there's no abandoning our attachment for sensual pleasures until we can develop the sense of ease that comes from getting the mind still, centered, solidly based in the present. This is how you teach the mind not to be overcome by pleasure or pain. Pain becomes a tool, an opportunity to learn about how the mind creates unnecessary suffering for itself around the pain. Pleasure too becomes a tool, part of the path. You don't want to see pleasure and pain as things to run away from or to run toward, but as tools you can use to give the mind more and more freedom. That way, if the body begins to wear down and the rest of your life begins to unravel, you don't lose your bearings. You realize that your happiness isn't based on a particular narrative. It doesn't have to be based on the body. It has a deeper foundation inside. And whatever the results of past bad actions you've done, if you develop these tools of having a sense of limitlessness in the mind, limitless goodwill, compassion, empathetic joy, equanimity, and a proper understanding of pleasure and pain, so you are not overcome by them, you'll have your escape. These are precisely the tools we learn as we meditate, teaching the mind to stay with the breath, and then using the breath as a tool for gaining greater and greater understanding. This is why when the Buddha explains issues of karma, he doesn't use mechanical images. His images are all fluid. We all have unskillful decisions, unskillful intentions that we've acted on in the past, but it doesn't mean we have to suffer from them. They will have their effects, but their effects are going to be mitigated or amplified by your present karma. It's as if we have two rivers coming together. If you've ever been at the spot where the little Colorado joins the Colorado, you see two very different kinds of water. The little Colorado is very muddy, the Colorado is clear. And right at the spot where they join, it's a mixture of the two. But as you go downstream, the muddiness disappears and the water is all clear. That's because the Colorado is bigger than the little Colorado. The muddiness is overcome by the clarity of the water, the larger river. This is what you want to do in your meditation. You want to make sure that your present karma is a bigger river of clear water. It'll take care of the silt that comes in from the little river if you develop the skills that can keep your present intentions clear and in focus. So this is our opportunity right here as we meditate, to keep this river of present karma as clear and as large as possible. The Luminous Mind. December 8, 2008. There's a passage in the canon where the Buddha says that the mind is Pabhasaram, luminous or radiant. He says that when people don't realize this, they can't develop their minds, they can't train the mind. When you realize that the mind is luminous and that its defilements are visitors, then you can train the mind. In other words, if you believe that greed, anger, and delusion permanently stain the mind, then you believe you can't train yourself. You can't develop the mind. You have to depend on outside forces, outside agents to come and save you. But when you realize that the defilements of greed, anger, and delusion come and visit it, in other words, they don't necessarily own it, they don't leave a permanent stain, then you can train it. And notice, the Buddha's not saying that the mind is naturally good or that its luminosity is its awakened state. Luminosity here simply means that it knows. Ajahn Mahabua has noted that if the Buddha had said the mind is pure by nature, you could argue with him. If it's pure, how can defilements come into it? But the Buddha simply says that it's luminous, which means it can know. Each moment we are able to be aware of things. No matter how many times greed, anger, and delusion have come into the mind, they go. There's always the possibility that you can notice their coming and going, see the effects of their coming and going, and realize that you have the choice of siding with them or not. That's what enables you to train the mind. No matter how thick the darkness of the mind, it's possible to shine a light in it. And once you shine the light, the darkness can't say, "I've been here for long a time, a tiny little light has no right to drive me right away." That's not the way light and darkness interact. As soon as light comes, the darkness is gone. Now you've probably noticed in your practice that there are many times when light comes and then disappears, and the darkness comes back again. That's because your clarity of mind is not yet continuous. But it is something that can be developed. As the Buddha says, we suffer from ignorance partly because of internal causes. In other words, hindrances like sensual desire, ill will, sloth and torpor, restless and anxiety, uncertainty obscure the mind. And they keep ignorance going. There's also inappropriate attention. When looking at the hindrances, or looking at the world, we're not really interested in the question of suffering or how to put an end to suffering. We've got other issues, other things we're more interested in. This is related to the external causes that keep ignorance going. We hang around with the wrong people. We don't listen to the Dhamma. Or even when we do, we don't take it seriously. So these are the things that keep the darkness going. Inappropriate attention and lack of noble friends. Even though the mind has the potential where it can know and be aware, these other factors influence it, which is why we need to train the mind in concentration to overcome the hindrances. To do this, of course, depends on seeing at some point that the reason we're suffering is not because of somebody else somewhere else, or the economic conditions, or the environment or whatever. It's our own ignorance. The moment of clarity that makes us realize we've got to work on ourselves. That's why we look for the right people, want to listen to the Dhamma, want to understand it, and want to practice. It's during those moments of clarity when you really see the connection between your actions and the suffering you experience when you recognize your own foolishness. That's when you're less willfully ignorant and can start willing in the other direction. As the description of right effort says, you generate the desire to get rid of unskillful qualities. You generate the desire to develop skillful qualities in their place. These are all activities in the mind. That word qualities here, Dhamma, can also mean actions. Remember that actions are not just things you do with the body, but also things you do with the mind. The path is something you fabricate. It's something you will, a truth of the will. In other words, if you don't will it, it won't become true for you. So this is what we're working on right now, trying to give the desire for what's skillful more power over the mind, so that there can be more moments of clarity, so that we can begin to weaken the causes of ignorance. And ignorance here is not just a general lack of knowledge. It's very closely connected with inappropriate attention. We're looking at the wrong things. We know the wrong things, or we frame the issues of our life in the wrong way. We need to become more and more consistent in looking at things in terms of the principle of skillful action, and then in terms of the principle of where there's suffering, what's causing it, what we can do to put an end to it. We want to make those questions the big questions in life. Ordinarily we miss out on these questions because so many other questions really seem insistent, the things we pick up from our own random ideas, or from the general values of society, which is one of the reasons why meditation requires that we learn to question the values we were brought up with, the ideas we picked up in the past, our narratives about the past, the way we cast those narratives. When you look back on your life, learn to recast the narrative. You can't just drop the old narratives of your life, pretend that they didn't happen, that you shut the door on them and you're no longer involved. They'll just keep sloshing around in the mind in the same old terms in which you've been framing them before. So you've got to reframe those narratives. Look at them in terms of where there was suffering, why there was suffering, what activity kept you suffering on and on and on in that particular way. And when you finally began to realize that you had to drop that kind of activity, that you could drop that kind of activity. When you can look at your life in that way, it's a lot easier to look at the present moment in the right way as well. So the process of meditation is not just pinning the mind in the present moment and putting it through the grinder of a particular technique, regardless of how you've been living your life. It's learning to reframe the issues of life. Getting a stronger sense of the importance of the questions the Buddha asked, and of the need to develop the path that can put an end to the suffering you've been causing and experiencing. In the process of developing the path, we're going to be developing skillful qualities, learning how to abandon the things that get in the way of knowledge, and to encourage qualities like mindfulness and alertness that strengthen your knowledge, strengthen your awareness, strengthen your insight and discernment. These things, like the defilements, are not part of the nature of the mind. Ajahn Lee has a good passage where he points out that the mind is neither good nor evil, but it's what knows good and evil, and it's what does good and evil, and ultimately it's what lets go of good and evil. That luminosity of the mind is neither good nor evil, but it does allow you to know. It creates the circumstances in which skillful qualities can be brought into being, in which they can do their work to bring the mind to a place where it goes beyond both the good and the evil, beyond that luminosity. Which means that the path is not inevitable. A Brahmin once asked the Buddha, "Is everybody going to gain awakening?" And he refused to answer. Then Ananda was afraid that the Brahmin would go away misunderstanding, thinking that the Buddha was stymied by the question. And so he took the Brahmin aside and said, "Suppose there was a fortress with a wise gatekeeper and only one gate into the fortress. The gatekeeper would walk around the walls of the fortress and wouldn't see any other means of entry into the fortress, not even a hole big enough for cat to slip through. He wouldn't know how many people would eventually come into the fortress, but he would know that everybody who was going to come in and out of the fortress had to come in and out through the gate." In the same way, Ananda Sai, the Buddha realized that whoever was going to gain awakening would have to come through the path of the Noble Eightfold Path, the 7 factors for awakening, and the different sets in the wings to awakening. As for how many people would follow that path, that wasn't his concern. So it's not inevitable that we're going to gain awakening. In other words, we don't have an awakened nature that forces us to gain awakening at some point. What we do have is a desire for happiness and a luminous mind that can know. It's capable of knowing that there is suffering, and it's capable of watching, developing the qualities that allow you to see where the suffering comes from and to see that it's not necessary, that you can put an end to it. This is important because sometimes when people gain a luminous state of mind or a wide open state of mind, they think they've hit their awakened nature. But the luminosity is not part of awakening. It's a condition that allows the mind to see, but the awakening comes from our determination not to keep on suffering. That was Ajahn Mun's last message to his students. You're a warrior doing battle with defilement, with discernment as your prime weapon. And what in the mind is the warrior? The determination not to come back and be the laughingstock of the defilements, the determination not to suffer again. Don't let go of that determination, he said, until it has done its job. So there's a necessary element of willing in the path. Without that willing, it just doesn't happen. The luminosity of the mind is what allows the will to do its work, allows us to straighten out our own minds, to train our own minds. We don't have to go around hoping for some outside power to come and save us. We've got our ability here to see the connection between suffering and its cause, and to find a path to the cessation of suffering, with which you can let go of the defilements. When there are no more defilements, you can let go of the path, which is compassed just of activities, because you've found something that's not An activity, something that's not fabricated. That's what we're working on. But you can't clone the unfabricated. You've got to do the work. You've got to develop the factors that give rise to clarity of mind, clarity of vision that can push away those clouds of defilement. When you get the causes right, the effects will take care of themselves. So try to be very clear about what you're doing, because that's a huge area where ignorance lies. Around what we're doing and the results of what we're doing. We tend to be very willful about not wanting to admit to ourselves what we're doing or what our intentions are. We also tend to be very willful about not wanting to see the unfortunate effects of some of our actions. This is why the Buddha, when he was giving instructions to his son, focused on just this issue, telling him, look at what you're going to do, look at what you're doing, and look at what you've done. Try to be very clear about the results of your actions. That reflection is how you begin to see through the clouds of delusion that otherwise keep moving in all the time. When you can see through your delusion, you realize that it doesn't have to be there all the time. This principle is what allows us to practice. This principle is what gives us hope, confidence, that there is an end to suffering. If you act on it, there will come a day when it's not just a hope or confidence, it's actual knowledge that there is a deathless, and it's totally free from suffering of every kind. As today's session comes to a close, we extend an invitation for continuous engagement. Just as Buddha encouraged sharing his teachings, we invite your active involvement. Contribute to disseminating these profound teachings universally by subscribing, liking, and sharing. Your participation ensures these invaluable insights resonate widely. Seize this opportunity to spark positive change and foster understanding. We eagerly await your continued presence in future episodes, joining forces to enlighten minds and nurture compassion globally.